Good afternoon. This is Will Lockwood from ComputerTalk magazine, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. With us today, we have Patrick Grody from Human Resource Profile, and I will pass it to Patrick to begin the presentation. Patrick, please go ahead.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for sticking with us. Again, I'm Patrick Grody, National Account Manager for Regulated Industries here at HR Profile. Here to talk about employment screening compliance and the federal laws and bodies that take care of those processes. First, I'd like to thank Will Lockwood for setting up this webinar and getting all the invites out and getting us up and running. I really appreciate that. Thank you, Will. So with that, let's just go ahead and jump right into it. What we're going to talk about today is, first of all, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, commonly referred to as the EEOC. Everybody that hires has to follow a couple basic rules. Whether you're hiring a stock boy for your pharmacy, a lead pharmacist, or a CEO, you need to follow these rules when running background checks on your employees. And the EEOC is the body which regulates anti-workplace discrimination laws. They've instituted a number of lawsuits, and they've made it known that they're really interested in how background checks interact with discriminatory practices in employment. So they have been relatively active. We'll talk about what they want from you in your background check processes, as well as how to avoid their scrutiny. And the next thing we'll talk about is the Fair Credit Reporting Act, commonly referred to as the FCRA. The Fair Credit Reporting Act was amended in 1997 to also apply to background checks which are conducted for employment purposes. It sets out a couple guidelines that all employers who use a vendor for background checks have to follow. We'll talk about those guidelines, and we'll also talk about how you can work to stay compliant with those guidelines. There are a few simple steps that you can take to drastically reduce your exposure to liability from both of these sources, and I will share those with you as well before ending with a question and answer portion at the end of the webinar. So before we get into that, let me give you a little bit of background about HR Profile. We're a full-service employment screening firm, commonly referred to as a consumer reporting agency or a CRA. What we provide is services that you'll be very familiar with: background checks, drug tests, employment verifications, reference testings, those kinds of things. But we also partner with companies such as the Divine Group, Personnel Profiles, other personality testing companies, to give you a better look at maybe the personality of your applicant as well as their criminal history. We also have a number of partners who are technical partners as well, who provide software solutions to our clients, like applicant tracking systems, HRIS systems, and things of that nature. We do have our own in-house team of computer developers. They've helped to build all of the systems used in our background checks, which are all proprietary to our company. We own all of them. We give them away for free along with our background checks. That is all proprietary to HR Profile. We have been building those systems since our inception in 1991, and we've worked continuously to perfect them. We did start off exclusively performing background checks as a three-person operation back in 1991. We've grown a little bit since then. We now process over 1,000 background checks per day, with the infrastructure in place to process as many as 3,000 per day. We do those background checks for companies nationwide and worldwide. We're present in all 3,000 plus counties in the United States, in all 4,337 county courts in the nation, as well as the vast majority of countries in the world. There was a point in time when I could say every country in the world, but we found it pretty difficult to get a background check out of North Korea recently, and pretty impossible out of Syria. But other than those exceptions, we have a global presence. So with that, let's just jump right into it. What the EEOC wants to see when you run a background check is that all applicants for a position are given due consideration with their individual quirks and strengths taken into account, and with all of their flaws being treated in light of their entire personal and professional history. Now, if that sounds like a tall order, it's because it is. The EEOC is interested in finding a way to ensure perfect fairness in the employment process. Fortunately, that's not put entirely on the employer for your background check processes. We do have a couple simple rules to live by with the EEOC. For background checks, what the EEOC wants to see is that whenever you find criminal information on your applicants, and it will differ by industry, but the overall average is somewhere around 16% of applicants will have some kind of negative information on their background check. Whenever you do find that criminal information, the EEOC wants you to assess how that negative information will affect the applicant's ability to complete their job function. For instance, if you're hiring a stock boy for about 20 hours a week, and it comes back on his background check that 6 years ago he wrote a bad check and spent a few months in jail, the EEOC would require that you examine whether or not that criminal information will inhibit his ability to stock products effectively. Now, the EEOC doesn't have a standard answer for that. It might be that your stock boy is going to have a universal key to the pharmacy, and they're going to have access to your back room with financial records. They're going to have access to cash registers and all kinds of financial access. And maybe your answer is yes, I don't want somebody who writes bad checks to have that key. What the EEOC is interested in is whether or not you asked that question, whatever the answer is, whether or not you assessed that criminal information for your particular job title. And I will say they've been incredibly active in this area. They're really trying to flesh out what the courts will defend in terms of how much scrutiny is enough scrutiny. They even went so far as to institute a lawsuit claiming that all background checks were racially motivated, since minorities are convicted at a higher rate than Caucasian Americans. Their claim was that running a background check at all would be unfair to minorities. They lost that lawsuit. I don't mean to scare you too much about that. They did lose that lawsuit, but that's the kind of thing that they're paying attention to and looking for in terms of how you use criminal information from a background check. So I would highly suggest, based on that, that you limit your background checks to a 7-year look back, which is what the EEOC has said is as far back as is relevant. They seem to believe that anything over 7 years is just irrelevant criminal information. And I would also suggest seriously scrutinizing any records that come back which are over 5 years old, because they seem to be moving towards that limit. So in terms of relevance, in terms of the type of crime committed as well as the timing of the crime committed, is what the EEOC is looking for out of your background checks. So the next question would be, how does this apply to our drug testing? And let's keep it simple. It doesn't yet. This will not affect your drug testing systems. In terms of your employment screening, this will govern your background checks and not drug testing. Let's try to keep it as simple as possible. The next question that I hear a lot is, what does this mean I need to do? Well, it does not mean that you have to ignore criminal information that comes back. I want to stress that again. If you find criminal information on an applicant, the EEOC does not, across the board, expect you to ignore that criminal information. They've admitted that background checks are a vital part of the employment process and that you're entitled to see that employment information. They're simply looking for that extra level of scrutiny where you tie the information to the relevant requirements for your job. And the best way probably to do this is to do it before you actually run the background check. Let me tell you what I mean by that. You want to limit the scope of the information that you are looking for to only information that is relevant to the position that you're seeking to fill. You do not want to run a credit check on your stock boy that would return financial information unless you have a reason for that financial information. You don't want to run a nationwide, all states, $100,000 background check on somebody who is going to be taking a warehouse position. It's simply not relevant for the position at hand. So a lot of CRAs, of the good CRAs I could say, are creating tailored packages and tailored searches for the different levels of employees within your organization. I help create these packages every day, and what I hear a lot is we need to set up a background check process that includes credit checks, federal district court checks, and statewide court checks. Now, the question you need to ask yourself at this point is, what do I need these checks for? Do I need the credit checks for an accountant? Maybe I need a federal district court check for an executive to make sure that they haven't had any high-level federal or interstate crimes. And maybe I need a statewide background check on a traveling salesperson, outside salesperson, to make sure they're never in one spot for very long. So I need to make sure that they have a clean record throughout the entire state. If you bundle all of these searches together, however, they become inappropriate for each job function. There's no reason to run a nationwide background check on an accountant. There's no reason to run a credit check on a traveling salesperson, by and large. And there will be exceptions, but by and large, there's no reason to do that. So what you need to do is make sure that your background checks are tailored for the positions that they're relevant to. And if you do, you'll avoid the vast majority of EEOC scrutiny. That is what they want to see out of a background check process. I know it sounds like a broken record, but the EEOC has been hammering on that requirement for a long time, and I just want to make sure that it's clear. So let's move on to the FCRA. The FCRA applies to background checks anytime an employer hires a consumer reporting agency, or again a CRA, to collect information regarding an applicant's fitness for hire or an employee's fitness for promotion. This includes background checks, reference checks, employment verification, all the services you commonly associate with a background check company governed by the FCRA. It does not apply to drug testing. I'll stress that again. Neither of these bodies or laws apply to drug testing. Drug testing is a separate animal governed by state laws, but not by these federal requirements. So, the FCRA exists so that applicants can have a chance to correct false information that's found in their file. Let me give you an example of when that can happen, even with a thorough background check and a good background check company. We once had an applicant who called in and swore on his mother's grave that he had not committed any of the 10 offenses that we had found on his background check. He claimed he had never even had a speeding ticket in his life, and one of the crimes that we reported was assault on an officer. And he just didn't understand how these things could be showing up on his record. Well, we heard that, and we talked through it with him, and then we went and we dug a little bit deeper. We showed him that his social security number, his name, his date of birth, and a signature appeared in a lot of court records and on all the police reports for the crimes. He was shocked. He had no idea how this could have happened. And he demanded that we dig deeper. Now, let me stop there because the FCRA doesn't require us to dig any deeper than that. You have to show them where you got the information and verify that the information is correct out of the court level, and that is the end of your requirement. But frankly, we were curious. This seemed like a really upstanding guy. He wasn't trying to be annoying or obnoxious. He was just really confused. So we did dig a little deeper on his behalf, and we found headshots from some police reports. It turns out that his brother had been arrested a couple of times. Every time he had given the applicant's social security number, name, and date of birth and signed where he needed to his brother's name. Now, if we hadn't followed FCRA procedures and notified him of the negative information, this applicant would have never known that those records existed. How could he? He had never been arrested. How would he know that he had an assault on a police officer in his record? Once we told him, he was able to contact the county courts and have those records changed over to the correct offender. And that's what the FCRA is there to do. It's not there to prevent you from making decisions based on criminal information. It is just there to verify that the information is correct and give the applicant a way to fix it if it's not. So with that in mind, let's get into these 5 basic steps that the FCRA actually requires from you when doing a background check. The first step is a disclosure to the applicant that you are going to run a background check on them. This is pretty obvious. You have to tell someone before you run the background check. 99% of the time, this will be done in writing. There are a couple exceptions. The most notable one is if you have truckers or DOT workers who are on the road a lot, the FCRA has an exception for them where their disclosure can be given over the phone. If you have that situation, I'd highly recommend working with your CRA. It can be a little tricky. The second step after disclosure is authorization. You have to obtain a signed writing that authorizes the background check. Again, 99% of the time, this is going to be in writing, on paper, or electronically, and there's an exception for truckers. Additionally, however, you must retain the signature on their employee file. So those first two steps, disclosure and authorization, obviously have to be conducted before the background check. You have to disclose and receive authorization to run the background check beforehand, otherwise the steps would make no sense. However, if the background check comes back with negative information, there are 3 additional steps that you must take before declining employment or firing the employee. So after disclosure and authorization, the third step is called pre-adverse action. In this step, you have to inform the applicant that negative information has been found either on their criminal record, in their references, that you haven't verified a degree, whatever it is that is preventing you from hiring this person, you have to disclose it to them, give them a copy of the report, and then you have to tell them that you are considering whether or not to deny employment, deny promotion, or fire the employee due to that information. Now, I stress considering because it is inappropriate at this point to tell the person that you've made a final decision. That's for later in the process. This is where you give somebody the notice that there is negative information without you having made a decision about it. You must inform the applicant of who generated the report in this pre-adverse action notice, that is your CRA, who ran the background check, and how they can be contacted. And there's a list of rights that must be submitted along with this pre-adverse action notice. A lot of CRAs, the best CRAs, honestly, are providing all of these items prefabricated because they're pretty easy to generate and fill in the blanks, along with your list of rights to their clients to be given to anybody that needs to have adverse action taken against them. So those are the first 3 steps: disclosure, authorization, pre-adverse action. The fourth step is very easy. You have to let the applicant have an opportunity to contact the CRA and whoever generated the report and get the information they need to resolve any conflicts that might exist, to either explain how this negative information came to be on their report, or to get it fixed. Courts have held that 5 business days is a long enough pause. We recommend that you maybe think about a 6 or 7 day waiting period. You know, doing the bare minimum that courts have authorized sometimes doesn't look good to regulatory agencies. That 1 day might be long enough to differentiate you from other employers and save you from some needless lawsuits. The 5th and final step is the final notice of adverse action. This is a very simple letter stating that you have made your final decision and you're not going to hire, promote, or retain the employee or applicant due to the adverse information found in their background check. This is a very simple process. You basically just have to let the applicant know that this process is over and you're done considering them. Now, these 5 steps are really simple and they're pretty easy to automate, but they're absolutely essential. Many companies are failing to properly structure their disclosure and authorization, actually, which are rather specific technical documents. The process is very easy, but the way that they're formulated is very technical and has a lot of legalese. And a lot of companies are structuring them improperly and are being sued for millions of dollars. Dollar General paid out $4 million in 2014 for its disclosure and authorization. Domino's paid out $2.5 million in 2013. And this year it's expected that Uber will settle a suit due to its authorization and disclosure. I'm not saying this and throwing these numbers out here to scare you. I'm just trying to point out that these are not invisible issues. Plaintiffs' attorneys can spot these issues and they can smell the money in the water from these class action lawsuits. So it's probably behooves you to pay attention to them as well. A good CRA will be out ahead of these issues, and they will have taken care of this for you. At HR Profile, for instance, we have a compliance team of about 3 people, including myself as corporate counsel, and we manage these issues for our clients. Not retroactively. We don't worry about lawsuits that happened in the past because we've already taken care of those issues ahead of time. What we're looking for is the next big issue that might hit the courts, and we take care of it ahead of time and get all of our forms accurate and up to date to keep you compliant. Because these issues are constantly changing, and if your background check company isn't helping you to revisit your forms and keep them up to date, I would highly recommend that you seek legal counsel on your own to make sure that you are remaining compliant. Again, these are not invisible issues and they are not cheap issues. So making sure that your forms are correct is a very important part of conducting a background check. That's the conclusion of my prepared talk. I thought now might be as good a time as any to open up the floor to, I believe we have a couple pre-submitted questions. Right here is a list of the offerings that we have here at HR Profile. I know that a lot of these will be very familiar to you. Criminal conviction history, obviously, credit history, motor vehicle report, but a couple other of them might be something you might not have seen from other employment screening companies, and I wanted to make you aware of what we do. So, Will, you want to jump into the questions?
Sure. Let's jump into some of those questions. We had 4 submitted from the registration process, and we'll just go through them in order. The first is there one thing that makes companies more susceptible to lawsuits over any other? And they followed up by asking, what is it that companies fail to do? So if you had to prioritize and pick that top thing, Patrick, what would it be?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the first part of the question?
Sure. Is there one thing that makes companies more susceptible to lawsuits over any other?
I would say that the most visible problem in conducting background checks is probably adverse action. Not sending an appropriate adverse action notice is grounds for a lawsuit in and of itself. So whether or not you conducted the background check properly, got a proper authorization and disclosure, if you just call the applicant and say, hey, there's some stuff on your background check and we're not going to hire you, thanks, bye, or you fail to inform them at all and you just remain silent, that is the easiest way to be non-compliant. Again, all of the issues that I've mentioned have been litigated. Every single one of them has been litigated, but that is the easiest one to fall into.
Okay, great. And let's see here. Then the next question we had was, what are the ramifications for disciplinary action of employees when warranted?
The ramifications for disciplinary actions of employees.
Mm-hmm. So I think what we're getting at there, to me, it sounds like if you have to take disciplinary actions with an employee, what is it you need to be attuned to make sure that you're doing this in the right way, you're managing that human resource process in the right way?
I see. With regards to background checks, essentially follow your adverse action. That'll keep you compliant. I think the bigger deal here is going to be for drug testing. If you do a for-cause drug test, somebody shows up and they're obviously on something, and you send them for a reasonable suspicion drug test. You just want to make sure that their behavior is well documented before you send them. You need to make sure that your drug testing policy is spelled out beforehand, either in your employee handbook, in their sign-up papers, in their employment packet, somewhere. It's well documented what your policy is. And you want to have it written somewhere that arriving under the influence of any substance, other than maybe caffeine, is grounds for dismissal. And as long as it's spelled out beforehand and you have your procedures properly defined, the ramifications just simply don't exist for the federal bodies. I will say that depending on your state, that can change. I know Montana has a very strange drug testing law where they don't allow reasonable suspicion drug testing. For instance, in Montana, you have to have some kind of accident causing, I think they call it significant damage without defining that term. So your state may have a different rule, but in terms of federal employment law, you're really just looking at having a well-defined procedure that you follow. Now, if you don't follow that procedure, that's a different issue.
Okay, so it's largely having the procedures in place and following them, which is something many pharmacies should be familiar with, from things like there's a lot of policy and procedure policies and procedures requirements within pharmacy. So this is just another aspect of that.
Okay.
Okay. How the third question was, how do these important HR topics and rules apply to small business, fewer than 50 employees? Are there differences?
There are not. Essentially, the only difference is the level of scrutiny that you need to give an individual applicant. If you're only considering 3 or 4 people for a position in a small company, as opposed to say you're Rite Aid and you're considering 1,000 people for the pharmacist position, the level of scrutiny you may need to give their criminal background may go up, but the EEOC has not been clear about that. So essentially, from the lawsuits that we have to date, there is no difference for background checks between a small company and a large company in terms of your exposure to liability. Now, obviously, if you have 10,000 violations, the law allows greater damages than if you only have 2. I guess that would probably be the biggest difference.
Okay. Great. So then the final question, and we'll wrap up with this one, I think, is what questions can be asked and what personal information can be shared within a company? And I think this is from the perspective of making sure that information that's supposed to remain private remains private.
Right. So the biggest concern in the background check industry is personally identifiable information, name, social, date of birth. You can clearly ask an applicant for all of those things in order to run a background check. Of course, date of birth can only be asked for that purpose, to run a background check. Otherwise, you're looking at an age discrimination lawsuit. But you can ask those questions. That information, as long as it is kept secure, sent over secure email, not written down and left out in the open, only sent through secure fax lines. That information can be shared with anybody who needs it. Basically, anybody in recruiting or HR, executives if they're involved in the hiring process. For drug testing, however, you start to run into HIPAA violations. I'm sure everybody here knows what a monster HIPAA has become recently. And for drug testing, essentially, you need to make sure that you are not receiving the results of drug tests in any way in an unsecure fashion. If you are receiving your drug tests via fax, you need to make sure that that is in a secure, locked position where nobody will be able to see it except those who are entitled to it. You need to make sure that it is either saved or destroyed after it's considered. If you're receiving it via email, HR Profile will send your results via email, but we do not send the background check itself. We actually send you a link to an online account that requires a few steps of verification before we will give you your results, and that is HIPAA compliant. So essentially, you need to be aware of what information is protected in background checks. That is the social, the name, and the date of birth. In drug testing, you need to be aware that HIPAA is applicable for drug testing results. And whatever your HIPAA policy is, I'm sure most people here already have some kind of HIPAA policy. You need to make sure that it conforms with your policy, and you need to make sure that you're receiving your results in a secure fashion. You think that answers the question, Will?
Yeah, I think that does. That sounds like it does answer the question, and it's something that, again, as you point out, pharmacies and technology vendors to pharmacies should all already be pretty familiar with these kinds of processes, and it's
Right.
just a matter of
Right.
applying it properly within the HR and the background check process.
Right.
Yeah,
A
yeah.
significant number of the background checks we do every day are for healthcare companies, nursing homes, hospitals. We have a couple pharmacies as well that we take care of, and most of them already have a secure email policy set up. And what we will do, and I can't guarantee that other consumer reporting agencies will do this, but I know a few that do. What we will do is contact your IT department and make sure that we have end-to-end encryption, is what it's called, so that nobody but you can read the email, and then we can send you the entire drug test over email if you'd like. But again, that's a function of HIPAA policy, and it changes from company to company.
Okay. Perfect. Then I think we will wrap up with that. And Patrick, I want to thank you for your time this afternoon and your expertise. And we'll follow up with everyone with access to the recorded presentation if they want to review it, and with Patrick's contact details in case you want to get in touch with him. And with that,
Right.
I'll say goodbye.
All right. Thank you so much for having us, Will.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.